talk about a very important issue where an International Monetary Fund team has arrived in Sri Lanka, and this is for talks on a bailout program. But the time is short for a country that just days from running out of fuel and likely months from getting any kind of monetary relief. Sri Lanka is battling its worst financial crisis since independence in 1948. Decades of economic mismanagement and recent policy errors, coupled with a hit from COVID-19 to tourism and remittances, has pushed foreign reserves to record lows. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the worst economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Joining me on the program today are KP Fabian, former ambassador to Sri Lanka, and Pramit Chaudhary, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Ambassador, let me start the program with you first. Before we talk about what is presently happening, let's try and put into perspective and understand why Sri Lanka is here today.
Thank you, Frank. Always a pleasure to be with you. I was Deputy High Commissioner, 79-82. Now, coming to the question, the media have been talking about the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, the worst since 1948 and all that. Yes, that is correct. But I think there is a problem, conceptual problem there. Because as you correctly said, we have to look at why there is an economic crisis. Instead of describing the crisis as the worst since 48 and all that, what caused the crisis? Now, you mentioned decades of financial mismanagement. Correct. But I wish to point out, subject to correction from others, that what really triggered all this is a political matter, that is misgovernance. Misgovernance arising from the fact that the people of Sri Lanka voted for a party that, what shall I say, filled the cabinet with brothers. I don't have to tell you how many were there, and also list the important portfolios, finance, agriculture, and so on. But it was a brotherocracy. It was not a democracy. And decisions were taken without the due process. Due process means the cabinet discusses matters based on, I repeat, because this applies not only to Sri Lanka, but to the whole world, based on inputs from the civil service. Not only inputs. Often, the cabinet paper is prepared by the secretary concerned. After negotiating with all his or her peers. Now, this was not happening. And therefore, a certain number of wrong decisions were taken. One, tax rates were cut to the advantage of the well-heeled. So there was fall in revenue. So they could not import the fertilizer. Then overnight a decision was taken. Sri Lanka was going to start with, organic farming. Now, organic farming is good, but you cannot start overnight. You have to prepare the ground for it. You have to prepare the farmers for it. And therefore, the agricultural production fell. Now, the other matters which you mentioned, the fall in tourist revenue and also the fall in income from abroad, that is correct. And COVID-19, all that is correct. But there again, misgovernance. The central bank governor told the cabinet, this is the time to go to IMF. That was quite some time back. Now, as you all know, it is better to go to the hospital before you have to be admitted to the ICU. So it is a series of acts of misgovernance, that have caused the so-called economic crisis. Actually, it's a politico-economic crisis.
Absolutely. Pramit, let me bring you into the picture now. Since the ambassador just brought up IMF, Sri Lanka now is looking for grants, is looking for loans from World Bank, from IMF, and from anywhere that they possibly can, because it's a dire crisis really in Sri Lanka. But this is going to take a while. I mean, the paperwork has to go through. There is a lot of back and forth that takes place. So even if there is some kind of relief, it's not going to be immediate. In the interim, what are Sri Lanka's options really?
It's been exercising that. India has already sent roughly $4 billion worth of assistance in the form of fuel, food, and fertilizer and medicine, all largely in the form of lines of credit. In other words, we essentially extend a credit which is rupee denominated, so it doesn't cost them anything in terms of dollars. And using that credit, they can buy from Indian companies. It adds to their debt, but it does not add to their foreign exchange crisis, because the debt is effectively denominated in rupees. And the Indian government has extremely generous. So that's basically the only thing they're doing right. Few countries have chipped in some aid, including China has offered also more debt. It has actually basically offered to just add more debt to what they already have. But again, I think that's dollar denominated. And some countries are offering aid of some variety, but that's just a few $100 billion here and there. But keep in mind, as President Ranil Wickremesinghe has said, he needs $6 billion roughly for the next 6 months, just basic essentials to keep the country going. That's food, as I mentioned, food, fertilizer, drugs, and fuel. And he doesn't have that money. He has almost nothing in terms of foreign exchange reserves. So they're living hand to mouth in terms of what they can get. And almost everything they're getting now is from India. So in the meantime, as you said, he needs to negotiate a deal with the IMF. There is a political obstacle, though, which is namely that the opposition parties are demanding that the president, Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, has to step down, or at least surrender the extreme presidential powers that were granted to him earlier before they're prepared to support a new government. The IMF has made it clear they cannot work with a government that is unstable. So you're basically caught in a trap right now. The politics has to be resolved before the IMF can help. But as you said, the IMF can take several months, probably in this case, because it's a clear-cut emergency. They could probably do it in 2 or 3 months to be able to bail out the Sri Lankan economy. Keep in mind that even after a bailout, there would be the reduction in Sri Lanka's GDP that it has experienced will be permanent. I mean, it'll continue for quite some time. The Sri Lankan rupee has gone from about 170 rupees to the dollar in 2019 to about 350 right now. And given a country that has always imported a large portion of its income, its requirements, this effectively means that this will, almost anything they import is now double the cost of what it used to be before, at a time when the world is facing inflation and fuel prices and fertilizer prices in particular are skyrocketing. So this means Sri Lanka will take a huge drop in its GDP. That's going to continue for several years, possibly decades, for them to recover. But that is the price they have to pay, frankly, for the extreme mismanagement of both their finances and their politics over the past few decades. One of the statistics I'll point out when it comes to their debt, between 2015 and 2019, Sri Lankan debt rose by almost 60%, foreign debt rose by 60%. That's not extreme, but when you look at the numbers, as Sri Lankan economists have pointed out, 90% of that debt was just interest on interest. In other words, they had taken loans that were impossible, not generating revenue, and were basically just piling up interest, and they were just allowing the interest to accumulate. But they were actually not doing anything productive with that money that was coming in. In addition, a lot of the debt they were accumulating, they had basically done legerdemain by taking it off the government's official books. So for example, they had taken a $900 million loan on the Hambantota port, which they sold to the Chinese. But what did they do with that? That was dollar-denominated debt, which is on which the Sri Lankan government was obligated to pay back. They put it into the account books of the Port Authority, but the central government was liable. And if the Port Authority defaulted, it was Sri Lanka that would have had to pay. So a lot of that debt was then put off the books, and they pretended, and I think Arwell began themselves, they did a debt issue.
Right.
You stand, get that IMF deal, but they're going to have to take a huge shock to their economy, where they have to their economy to be able to get out of it.
Right. Points taken, Pramit. Points taken. Seems to be a little difficulty in the line as well. Audio seems a bit choppy, but let me take the points that you're making forward and go to the ambassador. Now, ambassador, Pramit spoke about India's role, what India has done thus far, really, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. We've been a friend in a time of need. Is that how the Sri Lankans are taking it? Because we also saw an incident crop up with an Indian company, that is the Adani Group, and there was a lot of backlash in Sri Lanka as well, and a lot of it came across the shore to India too. How would you look at that situation with India being a friend and also this whole issue with the private company being involved?
Okay, now on India's aid to Sri Lanka, permit me to make one or two points. Very important point. India has not been going to town and telling the whole world, yes, we have given this to Sri Lanka, that to Sri Lanka, and it adds up to this much. No, India has been rather reticent, which shows diplomatic maturity. Second, we had a discussion at the IIC the other day, and what I, as moderator, noted was that the Indian panelists said that India was slow in sending aid to Sri Lanka. You know the story. Tamil Nadu proposed it, and there were discussions between Chennai and Delhi and all that. But can you imagine the Sri Lankan Deputy High Commissioner who was present? He said, no, India was prompt in rendering aid. Okay, that is one point. And you must have also seen Vikramasinghe, the Prime Minister, again and again thanking India and mentioning the amounts and all that. Now, coming to Adani's, I do not think we should confuse between reaction to a private company and, attitude towards India. I don't think the two are linked. That has its own story. We don't have to go into it. But in general, Sri Lanka, at the government level and elsewhere, are grateful for India's aid. Now, if I make a point about IMF, of course, good points have been made. That will take time, and unstable government is a matter of, something which will slow down. Correct. But I just want to add one more point, and that is IMF will insist on structural changes, adjustments. Primarily, it would mean cutting down subsidy, government subsidy on essentials, whether it is gas, petroleum, whether it is bread, whether it is something else. Now, that is going to be another problem, because IMF has a history of prescribing such draconian medication to economies in trouble, and, if I may say so, doubling their trouble.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Ambassador, I just have a follow-up question, to talk about, since we're talking about India, I want to bring in Nepal as well. After the earthquake, India really brought about a lot of aid to Nepal. We did wonderfully well. We were the first responders and we helped Nepal in a time of need. But later on, we saw that that goodwill turned and changed to bitterness. Is that something that we may witness in Sri Lanka as well because of the kind of politicians that are involved?
In my opinion, our High Commission in Sri Lanka and through other channels, we have made it very clear that we are helping the people of Sri Lanka, that we don't want to take a position in the politics that is going on. In other words, in plain English, whatever help is being rendered is not meant to prop up Rajapaksa. Now, coming to Nepal, correct me if I am wrong. My memory is that we went to town on what we did. And please remember, whatever comes in the Indian media is picked up in Nepal. And they minded it. So that is why I said, in the case of Sri Lanka, we have behaved with more maturity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Pramit, let's talk about another big player in Sri Lanka in all of this now and look at China as well. China has lauded India's efforts, that is one, but China has its own game to play in Sri Lanka. So where does this fit in the scheme of things?
Well, China hasn't come out smelling of roses in the because a pointer the other countries in is or say.
Pramit, I think there's a problem with the internet connectivity. If you could just reconnect and join back. In the meantime, let me just go across to the ambassador and try and get something else too out of him. If you could just reconnect and join us back with, in maybe a couple of minutes. All right.
I'll do that.
Ambassador, coming back to you now, let me take that point forward with you as well. China has a big role to play in Sri Lanka. Of course, not the entire. All of Sri Lanka's problems are not a result of what China has done in China's, checkbook diplomacy. But China has a lot invested in Sri Lanka as well, and it's going to want a piece of the pie at some point in time and want to play a bigger role or want to get something out of the entire situation. So how do you look at all of these, look at this?
China's behavior to me has been slightly mysterious. And in this context, I also want to tell you that at ITSA, IDSA, now it is Manohar Parrikar, DSA, we had a discussion on Sri Lanka quite some time back, 2 years ago, after Rajapaksa had taken over. And when Hambantota was very much in the news. And I wouldn't mention his name, but a retired Sri Lankan chief of Navy told us, no, China, our debt to China is of no consequence. And Hambantota and all those projects are very good for Sri Lankan economy. In other words, at the senior levels, there was a tendency to deny facts. That is one thing. Now, why China hasn't helped, or I cannot figure out, because we all remember, those of us who are old enough, the rice rubber agreement. Sri Lanka had rubber and China produced the rice, bought their rubber. And that made the two countries much closer. Now, then of course, China has invested, but why China has not done it, we do not know. But maybe they think that this Belt and Road, that is in so many countries, not only in South Asia, but also in so many countries, and they may not be wanting to create a precedent that a country which has been heavily engaged with the Belt and Road gets into economic difficulties, then it is China's obligation to come to the rescue.
Absolutely. Very interesting take there. Pramit, anything that you'd like to add on China?
Yeah, we're seeing in China, even in Pakistan, for example, which is one of China's two closest allies, the reluctance of China to bail out or provide large-scale assistance is remarkable. I mean, especially Pakistan of all countries, where you can actually you can hear reports and conversations with Pakistani that even the Pakistani army is now regretting that they cut off their ties with the United States because the Americans were much more generous and their weapons were better. than the Chinese. But the Chinese have basically told Pakistan, which itself is going from economic crisis to economic crisis. They've imposed 12-hour power cuts in an attempt to save fuel. They've told their people not to drink tea because they don't have enough money to import tea. The Chinese have basically said, please go to the IMF. They said exactly the same thing, and it's a bit strange. India obviously is not going to bail out Pakistan, but Pakistan is an interesting situation where they have nobody else to turn to. So China, for example, for some whatever reason, and we're not certain why, there is evidence that when they have attempted to bail out countries, when they've attempted to take large chunks of their money and give it to help larger international causes, there has been at least a large social media backlash inside China, which has tended to scare the Chinese government. Too many Chinese basically say the sewer outside my house is overflowing. Why are you giving money to some foreign people who I don't know anything about? And this seems to not go down well with the Chinese system. They have often come to India, in fact, in the past and said, would you like to join the BRICS in giving money to somebody? Because then we can hide behind the BRICS or the National New Development Bank to give assistance, but we can't give it directly. Second, in the One Belt, One Road initiative, they have now begun shifting to the idea that they will do soft infrastructure. In other words, they will do telecommunications networks, digital systems, satellites, one, because they're cheaper, but because it also gives China access to data, and being able to absorb huge amounts of data has now become, and steal a lot of data, has become in many ways their overriding economic interest, much more than just building infrastructure, because they see that as really the battle in the 21st century. Data is they say the new oil, but it's really the new capital, if you wish, in terms of what happens in the future. So that is a different type of infrastructure. It's inexpensive and it continues to spread there, especially in places like the Middle East and Africa. They're still making a lot of inroads. But this immediately devalues the importance of things like Hambantota Port. So Hambantota Port, for example, the original plan was they take it over, but they have to then move in a lot of Chinese companies into that area, because Hambantota Port is in the middle of nowhere. And 70% of Hambantota Port's trade is with India. It's not with any other. It's dominated by trade from India. India began cutting off that trade, saying no company in India, based in India, should use Hambantota. Hambantota has collapsed as a port. But China didn't take its place. They didn't replace the Indian companies with Chinese companies. And I think they just decided this was too much of a cost to bring in Chinese firms and so on into part of the country, a part of the world in which they had no standing or investment. So for whatever reason, the Chinese seem to have decided to narrow the scope of their investments. They seem very reluctant to spend money bailing out people, even their closest friends. And you can see that they've now switched a lot of their focus to the South Pacific and to Southeast Asia, closer home, if you wish, rather than to the Indian Ocean. Even in Africa, they're starting to cut back on anything other than very profitable mineral investments. But they seem to want investments which make money. And they're reluctant to deal with countries which they feel will keep coming back to them for more and more money, which they're definitely reluctant to provide.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. It's time to get closing comments now with the best way forward, starting first with the ambassador.
Well, I think India should continue with what it has been doing, but I would have been happier if much earlier India had convened an Aid Sri Lanka International Conference and invited all concerned, including China. In fact, there is SARC, there is ASEAN, there is BRICS. So India could have, very thoughtfully worked out a list of invitees, of course, the IMF and the P5, and taken the initiative. I'm not suggesting that this thought would not have crossed the mind of MEA. Probably they would have thought about it, and for good and sufficient reasons, they decided not to do it. But I thought of sharing that thought.
Absolutely. And Pramit, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, so the IMF has to be the core of the response. One of the problems that Sri Lanka has is that the Rajapaksas infuriated so many foreign governments, including their most generous donor, which was Japan, that when they asked countries, or countries like Japan were asked to help, they refused. They said no. The Rajapaksas deliberately humiliated Japan 3 times on giving projects that Japan had developed and handing them over to Chinese companies without warning the Japanese. That the Rajapaksas had literally no friends anywhere in the world, including China. The United States actually rebuffed the Rajapaksas and said the Biden administration has strict orders not to help your government. So having isolated themselves, it was almost impossible to put together a multilateral effort. So the game now has to be through the IMF, but the process has to be accelerated. And I think one of the things that they may have to India may have to try to persuade the Sri Lankans is that you can't wait for the final political settlement of the Rajapaksas, because that they could dig themselves in for quite a long time. There's simply not enough time to do that. At least some sort of interim financial deal has to be made, whether or not the changes to the constitution and presidential executives are done in the meantime. Because right now, I'm not certain they have enough time to do that, and the Rajapaksas don't seem to be willing to give that. They still have the votes in parliament to block anything, including changing the constitution.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Wonderful discussion on the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Thank you, Ambassador Fabian and Pramit Chaudhary as well for joining me and putting things into perspective for us. All right, then, once again, let me remind you to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon as well, and share the content too so that more people get to know about Bharata First. What is coming out of this discussion is very clear that Sri Lanka is in a very difficult situation, and it seems like the IMF is its only bet for the long term and in the long run, but it comes with its own set of problems and its own sets of rules and regulations. The Rajapakshas at the moment have no friends, and that is why countries from around the world are trying to keep away from Sri Lanka and not have anything to do with the island nation. India seems to be doing all it can at the moment, being Sri Lanka's friend in its time of need, but New Delhi has maintained a very clear stand that all the efforts that are being undertaken to help Sri Lanka is for the people of Sri Lanka, and we are staying away from the politics and staying away from the political class, because that's something that we do not want to get involved in, because once bitten, twice shy. Of course, there has been a controversy with regards to the Adani group, but like the ambassador just pointed out, that is a matter that is private in nature and should be left at that. But there's no relief in sight for Sri Lanka anytime soon, and it looks like the people of Sri Lanka will have to go through a little more tough time in the months to come. We just pray that the economic crisis comes to an end sometime soon. Tourism picks up and the economy of Sri Lanka picks up as well, because Sri Lanka has been an old friend. We've had ties with Sri Lanka going back to thousands of years, and we would like to see Sri Lanka flourish. Also, let me remind you about the Bharata First Knowledge Center. There are new courses that have been launched, which I would like to share with you. The details, of course, will be coming up in a short while from now. The details are also in the description of this particular video. Just hear this message out for a minute to know exactly what we have on offer. So that is, those are the two new courses on national affairs and international relations, year-long courses that will start in August 2022. I'll be taking them personally and guiding you through the entire process as well. So register now at kc.bharatafirst.com or download the Bharata First app. Let me also inform you that there are over 90% discounts going on at the Knowledge Center at the moment, so make full use of it. That's it from me. See you again next time.